I plan to record a couple more videos for Ferazel's Wand, one showing some unused content, another from the third-party plugins and things that fans made. But first I wanted to quickly show on the technical side how I recorded and played the game for anyone curious about that. To play the game, I use the Classic Mac emulator SheepShaver. It's very simple to set up. You just need a ROM, a Classic Mac installer, and there's some guides, a lot of resources out there to do it. I'll link to Immaculation.com since they also maintain some recent builds, and I'm using one of their SDL2 builds from earlier this year. The reason I like this build is that it allows me to run both the Classic Mac and Modern Mac concurrently, thanks to its native full screen support. It also has some really nice upscaling. So instead of 640 by 480, Ferazel's Wand upscales to a high resolution display, which looks really nice when I record it and play it at 1080p. So that's the SheepShaver side. When I actually play the game, I record it using QuickTime Player's built-in screen recording, which captures the native resolution at 60 frames per second. So that gets me the video. To get the audio, I wanted both the game's audio and my microphone so I could provide commentary and talk over the video. To do that, I'm using Soundflower. This is a kernel extension for macOS, which basically is a virtual device. Instead of outputting to your speaker, you can output to Soundflower, and it puts sound into that buffer, and that internal buffer can become a source for input. So instead of using just a microphone, you can play audio back out of Soundflower. It's a lot like Ambrosia's old tool Wiretap or Wiretap Studio, but it's a free alternative that allows you to record directly from your computer audio. That becomes really powerful when we pair it with Audio MIDI setup. So Audio MIDI setup supports aggregate devices. So here I have audio going both to my speaker output and Soundflower, so that when I have the input side, I can still capture the computer stereo audio as well as microphone. So I'm using that to capture all the audio in the video. Once I have everything recorded, I do a little bit of altering and processing of the audio. The main thing I do is auto ducking. So you've probably noticed that in my videos as I talk, the audio kind of ducks away in the background. The way I do that is I kind of amplify the audio a little bit. So this is, for instance, the audio track, and this is my commentary track. So the first thing I do is apply a little bit of equalization. Since I don't have a super fancy microphone, it can sound a little bit tinny at times. So you can do some equalization to make it a little warmer. Then I'll amplify that up. And then you can do auto ducking, which will automatically detect based on some threshold when you're speaking. And that will modify the sound. So for instance, here, this is just a clip of audio, but the sound begins to amplify up as the speaking drops off. So I do that as kind of a nice effect for the audio side. On the video side, I noticed something interesting in the way that SheepShaver and QuickTime interplay. QuickTime records at 60 frames per second, but SheepShaver is playing the game at something closer to 30 frames per second. So let me hop over and show you an example of this. This is a clip from me in the Scent of Peril Caverns, and you'll notice here at the time stepper, there's no change in frame. But once I go to 1052, the frame has changed, another duplicate frame, and now it changes again at 1054. So you're seeing basically every frame happens, at least twice. We have duplicate frames in here. As I said, we're recording at 60 frames per second, but it's really only running at 30 frames per second. But something interesting happened here. You see at 1104 and 5 and 6, I have the same frame. And then at 1107, I have this frame that only comes up once. We move on to another frame, and again, it's duplicated at 1108. So again, let me play this back. We have 1, 2, 3 of that frame, 1, and then 2, and then 2. And what this does effectively is if you trim this down to 30 frames per second, this 1107 frame is going to get dropped. And I think that's why Zarok mentioned he was having dropped frames. And I was thinking if I go down to 30 frames per second, which is the actual game's speed, I will also have dropped frames. So I looked around for an alternative. FFmpeg had some MP Decimate and other filters that are meant to do this, but I had a lot of audio-video synchronization issues using that. So I wrote a tool called Framefixer. I'm going to make this open source. I'll release it on GitHub and put a link to that. But basically, this uses C++ and OpenCV to go frame by frame through a video, and it analyzes the differences between frames. I had some trouble finding a good way to do the differencing. Ultimately, I decided on the standard deviation of the total change. So it looks at how much there is of change in an image to decide how important or unimportant that frame is. And then based on your settings, it will alter the slots given to different frames. So for instance, in the clip I showed you, you have 3 duplicate frames right here and only 1 for this frame. Well, that leads to that dropped frame. But when you reorganize, Framefixer will give you no dropped frames when you go down to 30 frames per second. Let me just show you how that looks on a fixed clip here. So again, we have duplicate frames. But once I get to this one here at 1104, instead of having 04, 05, and 06, it doesn't have 06. We've duplicated this frame so that now it's saved. And then we proceed as previously. So let me just show you kind of a live comparison of those two. Here on the left side is the original video, and on the right side is the altered video. This is knocked down to 30 frames per second, so you can see what frames are being lost on the left side. Again, we have a duplicate frame on the left side, but we've saved a frame on the right side. This is what Framefixer does. I run all the video through that, and the net result is that the animation looks a little bit smoother. There's a lot of character animation in this game, and I was just trying to make it look as smooth as possible, preserve as many frames as possible. I'll show you another little clip here of an example of a lost frame. On the right side, we have a saved frame, and now they're back in sync. But again, that frame was going to be lost on the right side, or on the left side. So Framefixer, there are other tools in FFmpeg that you can take a look at, but if you're doing something like this where you're trying to downsample and you don't want to lose content, or you want to emphasize the more important frames, consider taking a look at Framefixer. I wrote it specific to this task, saving video from SheepShaver and making it as smooth as possible. But there might be other cases where you want to downsample and focus on more important frames. Okay, the last thing I'm going to do here is just show you a direct comparison. So I've overlaid both the original video and the Framefix video, and I'm using a compositing for the differencing. So it's only showing you the difference between those two clips. And what you see is there's minor differences. There's a lot of times where it's not that much changing, but each of these little frames or alterations is at risk of being dropped. We actually do save quite a bit of smoothness that would otherwise appear as dropped frames in the 30 frame per second version. Yeah. Once I had all that processing done, I put the video and the audio together in Final Cut Pro, and I did all the rest of my cutting and editing in there. Now, I didn't actually record everything level by level. What I did, since the mechanics of saving in Ferazel's wand are one-time use at the save points, I recorded in sessions, and then I did a little bit of editing to cut and stitch things down to a single level by level playthrough. But that was basically my whole process, and I hope you found that useful. And again, I'll put links to the different tools that I used, and some guides for setting up and using these different things if you're curious to play them yourselves. So thank you for watching, and next we will look at some of the unused content of the game.